Heidi is in Calgary in Canada, and from personal experience knows what it's like when people come alongside her grieving and saying some things which frankly aren't very helpful, and a few things which are. Now, I can attest to this one too. Been there, done that, not particularly liked the t-shirt. Heidi's also written a book around this, and this is her passion, to encourage people to learn how to lean into grief, because grief is something that we will all experience, and it's a form of love. And love does not get done on its own, does it? It's partly shared with somebody else. So how to get alongside somebody else when they are grieving and learn how to do it, because we're not taught generally, are we? Another wonderful author and speaker, Heidi Dunstan. My darling, over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. I couldn't find the unmute button. My Alt-A wasn't working. So grief is a normal and a natural reaction to loss or change of any kind. When you witness deep grief, it's because you're witnessing deep loss and deep love. It wouldn't hurt if they didn't love their person, if there wasn't connection there. We grieve many things in life, not just death. You can grieve the loss of friendship, relationships ending, a loss of a job, change in our communities, a loss of a fur baby. We saw some dogs earlier today. Parents go through loss during empty nest syndrome. You can grieve losses as you change your health. For those of you in your early 40s and 50s, when you got to wear those glasses, that's a grief. You can have loss when there's a change in finances. There are so many things that we grieve. So many of us grieved while we went through the early stages of those lockdowns during COVID across the world. And yet there's no single way to move through grief. I truly believe that grief is as individual as your fingerprint. And that there's no right or wrong way to do it, which is one of the reasons why I believe it's so hard to support somebody who's grieving, because how they grieve can look completely different to how you would grieve. And so we kind of have these spaces where we judge people and judge where they should be at. Another challenge that comes with grief is that grief is an umbrella term. It describes a ton of different emotions. People can experience all of these different types of emotions, sometimes in the same hour or the same day. So they could experience sadness, anger, guilt, shame, regret, gratitude, anxiety, fear, and loneliness, and many other emotions, all in that short period of time. And as somebody who's witnessing it, they can be really overwhelming and oftentimes confusing to figure out what's going on. I call it the crazy train of grief. It's a 10 coupon ride and none of us get the choice to get off. It can be really complicated. Have you found it uncomfortable to speak to somebody who's grieving? Or maybe you felt like you said the wrong thing to somebody at that one moment? It's common. A lot of people have, and after I lost my husband in 2018 unexpectedly, I had people that I loved and trusted say things that often missed the mark. Just days after he died, I had a woman say to me, "I understand grief. I went through divorce." And even just days after his funeral, I had somebody say to me, "Don't worry, Heidi, you'll find love again," not acknowledging the fact that I was still in love with my husband. I don't believe these people said things in malice or with intent to hurt me. They were trying to help me, but they just didn't really know that they were missing the mark. They weren't acknowledging the pain I was going through. And that's oftentimes what happens. Over the last few years, as I've spent more time with grievers and people that have gone through loss, their stories are common to mine. They've had people that they love and trust say things that just don't align. So here's what we've been taught in most societies, knowing that we've got a global community here. Many of us have been taught to say, "I'm sorry for your loss," to send a card, sympathy card or condolence card, or maybe to send flowers. Maybe some of us will go out and make a casserole or a lasagna and send that over. We attend a service or a celebration of life, and that's about as far as it goes. Seriously, think about it. Our employers only really give us a few days of bereavement leave, and then it's back to work, ready or not. The reality is the grieving process goes long past our cultural ceremonies. And the first year can be so hard for grievers, having to move through the holidays, move through birthdays and events. Even just the day-to-day stuff can be incredibly emotional. And the world keeps spinning, leaving grievers to catch up in a world that doesn't make sense because their person isn't here anymore. The reality is, as many grievers just want to be seen. Their grief they just want their grief to be witnessed, which is why I'm here today, to share with you 3 things to say or do to support somebody who's grieving, and 3 things to avoid saying or doing. So let's start with what's to say. First of all, I would ask, how is today, rather than how are you? When we ask how are you in most cultures, good, fine, or okay are the only answers we want to hear. And a griever's none of those. Grief leaves them living in the moment. And when you ask how's today, you're opening the door for them to say, I haven't slept in days. I'm barely holding on. Or I can't sleep. Or this is really hard and I just miss my person. And it allows you to hear maybe some ways that you can be there and support them. Another way that you can say something that you can say to somebody is to use their person's name. Ask, is it okay if I share a story or a memory of your person? He was such a good friend of mine. Or ask, if you didn't know them, would you be willing to share one of your favorite memories? I'd love to learn about this amazing person that I see as you're grieving. Sometimes grievers are just looking for a place and space to share a memory, and all we have to do is ask and listen, and it can make such a big difference. And today, the last thing I'm going to share with you is to mark in your calendars the birthdays, the anniversary of the death, the wedding anniversary if it was a spouse. On the holidays, mark them as reoccurring yearly and reach out. Years later, just sending a text or a call to say, hey, thinking about you today. I know it might be a day of mixed emotions. Can make such a world of difference. Our world keeps spinning without these people, and for the people that are left behind, those days are etched in their being. So showing up on them years later can mean a lot to them. I have other tips and tricks. Later on, you'll hear about my upcoming masterclass later this week. Would love for you to join if you want to know more. But let's chat now about some things to avoid. I always say avoid any sentence that starts with at least. At least you can have another child. At least they aren't suffering anymore. These sentences minimize the person who's right in front of you. The person right in front of you is suffering. Don't minimize them, please. We live in this world that's always looking for a silver lining, and we use these sentences to try to find something good in it. But it does mean that we minimize and make somebody feel like how they feel doesn't deserve to be witnessed. Another phrase that I often encourage people not to say is time will heal. Time doesn't heal grief. Time changes grief. But grief is love. I will love my husband until the last breath I take, which means I will grieve him till the last breath I take. And the reality is I have a lot more better days than I have bad days, but I can still have days that are just as intense as the day I lost him. And the last thing I encourage you never to tell anybody is that they should be over it by now. I've heard some stories in the last few months even of people being told 5 weeks after losing a spouse or a child that they should be over it by now. Or that I heard a doctor tell a patient 9 months after losing her young husband that she takes the cake takes the prize in grieving the hardest for her husband. I couldn't have believed a doctor would say that to somebody. So as you can see with just a few small examples, words really matter in grief. I personally think that's why so many people say nothing at all, is because they fear saying the wrong thing. The reality is that if you don't know what to say that. Say, I don't have the words to make this better, but you're important to me and I want to be with you. I want you to know that I'm here. Because the silence in grief is deafening for grievers. And this is a way for you to be honest and show up and witness them. And if by chance you say something that misses the mark, own it. Apologize. Be open and say you're learning how to navigate this tricky time. Grief is hard, And when the wrong words come out, say, I'm so sorry, I just put my foot in my mouth. And that isn't what I wanted to say. And I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It's okay to make mistakes. It's not okay to gloss over or pretend that it didn't happen. Many people avoid grievers. Some of them, people even say they've watched their friends cross the street to avoid them. My belief is that when you feel like running away or avoiding a conversation with a griever, that's when it's time to lean in. That's when it's time to take that opportunity and witness their pain. Because there are some beautiful moments in grief. And when we allow for those times to connect, that is when we allow each other to grieve with grace together. Thank you.